The U-boat commander watches the convoy through his periscope. 20 merchant ships, fat targets, slow, defenseless, exactly what he's been hunting for. There are escorts, of course, a few destroyers circling the convoy, but he's dealt with escorts before. You avoid them. You wait for the right moment. You strike fast and disappear. He's done this dozens of times. This is what U-boats do. This is what makes them deadly. He positions the boat for attack, lines up on a tanker in the convoy's center, gives the order to fire torpedoes. The torpedoes run true. He hears the explosions through the hull. 2 hits. The tanker is burning. Time to go deep and slip away while the escorts chase ghosts. But something's different this time. One of the escorts turns toward him, not toward where he was, toward where he is right now. Then he hears something he's never heard before, a rapid series of splashes. Not depth charges rolling off the stern, something else. Multiple impacts, all around him. And then the ocean around his submarine explodes. Not above him, not behind him, right where he is. And he realizes the rules just changed. For the first 3 years of World War II, attacking a convoy was calculated risk for U-boats. Yes, there were escort ships, destroyers and corvettes, protecting the merchant vessels. But escorts were predictable. They used depth charges. And depth charges had limitations. Here's how it worked. A destroyer would detect a U-boat, maybe with sonar, maybe by spotting a periscope. The destroyer would charge toward the last known position. As it passed over that position, it would roll depth charges off the stern. Big drums of explosives set to detonate at a specific depth. The problem: by the time the depth charges sank to detonation depth, the submarine had moved. Could be hundreds of yards away. The destroyer was attacking where the submarine had been, not where it was. And there's another problem. When you're running over the target, dropping depth charges off your stern, you lose sonar contact. The explosions blind your sonar. You can't track the submarine during your attack. So depth charge attacks were basically educated guesses. You'd estimate where the submarine was going. You'd drop charges in a pattern. You'd hope one detonated close enough to damage the boat. It worked sometimes, but mostly it didn't. The success rate for depth charge attacks was abysmal, something like 5 to 6%. 1 in 20 attacks actually sank a U-boat. U-boat captains knew this. They knew the odds were in their favor. When escorts attacked, you'd go deep, change course, wait for the depth charges to stop, then either continue the attack or slip away. It was tense, it was dangerous, but it was survivable. The tactics were proven. The doctrine was solid. This is why U-boats were so successful in 1942 and early 1943. They could attack convoys, sink multiple ships, and usually escape. The escorts couldn't kill them efficiently. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won by Germany. The U-boats were sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. Then the Allies deployed a weapon that changed everything. A weapon that made convoy escorts deadly. A weapon that turned the Atlantic from a U-boat hunting ground into a U-boat graveyard. The Hedgehog. And suddenly, attacking a convoy became suicide. The Hedgehog looked weird, completely different from anything that came before. It was a mortar launcher mounted on the front deck of escort ships. 24 spigots arranged in a circle, each spigot loaded with a small projectile. When fired, all 24 projectiles would launch in rapid succession. Boom, 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 boom. They'd arc through the air and splash down in an oval pattern about 200 yards ahead of the ship. Each projectile weighed about 65 pounds. The explosive charge was only 35 pounds, much smaller than a depth charge's 300-pound warhead. But here's what made the Hedgehog revolutionary: the fusing system. Depth charges used hydrostatic fuses. They exploded at a preset depth based on water pressure. If they hit the bottom, they just sat there. If they missed the submarine, they exploded harmlessly. Hedgehog projectiles used contact fuses. They only exploded if they hit something solid. If they hit a submarine hull, they detonated. If they hit the ocean floor, they detonated. If they hit nothing, they just sank harmlessly. This changed everything about anti-submarine warfare. First, the Hedgehog fired ahead of the ship, not off the stern like depth charges. This meant the escort maintained sonar contact during the entire attack. You could see where your target was. You could adjust. You could fire again immediately if you missed. Second, the pattern of 24 projectiles created a footprint covering about 120 feet by 140 feet. If the submarine was anywhere in that area, you had multiple chances to hit it. Third, the contact fuses meant you only exploded if you hit. So if you heard an explosion, you knew for certain you'd hit the submarine. No guessing, no hoping. An explosion meant success. And finally, because the projectiles were smaller, you could carry more of them. An escort could fire multiple Hedgehog patterns in an attack. Keep throwing patterns at the target until something hit. The mathematics were brutal. With depth charges, you needed to get within about 20 feet of a submarine to damage it. With Hedgehog, you just needed one projectile to make contact. And you were throwing 24 projectiles in a pattern. The success rate for Hedgehog attacks was about 25%. 1 in 4 attacks sank or seriously damaged a U-boat. Compare that to depth charges at 5 to 6%. The Hedgehog was 4 to 5 times more effective. For U-boat captains, this was catastrophic. The weapon they'd learned to evade and survive suddenly had a much more lethal replacement. The first U-boats to encounter Hedgehog attacks didn't understand what was happening. U-264 was attacking a convoy in February 1944. The captain, Hartmut Lux, had successfully torpedoed one merchant ship. He was maneuvering for a second attack when an escort detected him. Standard procedure: go deep, change course, evade the depth charges. Lux took the boat to 280 feet and altered course. He waited for the depth charges. They didn't come. Instead, he heard a series of splashes. Quick succession, multiple impacts in the water around his position. Then silence. The splashes didn't explode. What were they? Markers, new sonar buoys, something else. Then one of the projectiles struck the pressure hull near the forward torpedo room. The explosion was different from a depth charge. Sharper, more focused, and it blew a hole right through the hull. Water flooded in under massive pressure. The forward compartment filled in seconds. The men there had no chance. Lux tried to surface. He had to. The boat was flooding and losing buoyancy. But the damage was too severe. U-264 went down stern first. 23 men escaped. 26 died. The survivors told interrogators about the weird attack. Multiple splashes that didn't explode like depth charges. Then one explosion that punched through the hull. They'd never experienced anything like it. Similar reports started coming from other U-boat encounters. Attacks that seemed different. Projectiles that only exploded on contact. Escorts that could attack while maintaining sonar contact. U-boat command tried to understand what the Allies had deployed. Intelligence was fragmentary. Some U-boats reported it. Others had no survivors to report anything. But the pattern was clear. Escorts had a new weapon. And it was deadly. By mid-1944, U-boat captains were reporting that escort attacks had become much more dangerous. The weapons seemed to hit more often. The attacks were more accurate. The survival rate was dropping. Once Hedgehog-equipped escorts became common, U-boat tactics had to change dramatically. The old approach, attack the convoy, evade the escorts, attack again, stopped working. Escorts with Hedgehog could maintain contact and attack accurately. Evasion didn't work as well. Some U-boat captains tried attacking from greater range. Fire torpedoes from farther away, then retreat before escorts closed in. But longer-range shots were less accurate, and escorts had gotten better at detecting attacks early. Some tried attacking at night on the surface, then diving only when forced to. The theory was to avoid being underwater where Hedgehog was most effective. But escorts had radar by 1944. Surface attacks were increasingly suicidal. Some tried ultra-deep dives, go below 300 feet, below the depth most escorts thought to search. But this limited maneuverability and drained batteries faster. The fundamental problem couldn't be solved tactically. The Hedgehog gave escorts a huge advantage. Once they detected you, they could attack accurately while maintaining contact. You couldn't shake them the way you could shake depth charge attacks. German submarine designers tried technical solutions. Better sonar to detect escorts earlier, acoustic torpedoes to target escorts directly, the snorkel to avoid surfacing. But these were incremental improvements against a game-changing weapon. The mathematics still favored the Hedgehog. Contact fusing plus forward throwing plus maintained sonar contact equals dead submarines. The British and Americans kept improving Hedgehog tactics too. They learned optimal firing ranges. They learned how to predict submarine maneuvers and lead the target. They learned to fire multiple patterns in quick succession. Some escorts got really good at it. Crews that practiced constantly. Sonar operators who could track submarines through evasion attempts. Hedgehog crews who could reload and fire quickly. These elite escort crews became submarine killers. A U-boat that encountered one of these experienced Hedgehog ships was in serious trouble. The psychological impact of Hedgehog attacks on U-boat crews was severe. With depth charges, you could hear them coming. You'd hear them hit the water. Then you'd count the seconds until they detonated. It was terrifying, but predictable. With Hedgehog, you'd hear the splashes. Then nothing. Just silence. You'd wait, not knowing if one of those projectiles was about to hit your hull. Then one would explode, right against the hull. And you'd know, if that one hit a few feet to one side, it would have punched through into a critical compartment. You survived by luck, not skill. The randomness was psychologically devastating. You could do everything right and still die because one projectile in a pattern of 24 happened to hit your hull. Some crews developed severe anxiety about attacks. When they heard those distinctive multiple splashes, panic would set in. Some men would freeze. Others would start hyperventilating. Commanders had to maintain discipline during attacks, but they were just as scared as their crews. They knew the statistics. They knew Hedgehog was far more effective than depth charges, and there was nowhere to hide. If an escort detected you and closed to Hedgehog range, your odds of survival dropped dramatically. You couldn't outrun it. You couldn't go deep enough to avoid it. You could only hope none of the projectiles hit. The sound of Hedgehog projectiles hitting the water became a sound of dread. Like hearing a death sentence read out. You'd hear those splashes and know, in the next few seconds, you'd either survive or die. And you had no control over which. Some U-boat crews refused to go back out after experiencing Hedgehog attacks. Courts-martial were held. Some men were shot for refusing orders. But the fear was rational. Hedgehog made convoy attacks far more dangerous. The psychological warfare aspect was just as important as the weapon itself. U-boat captains who'd attacked convoys confidently for years became cautious, hesitant, more concerned with survival than aggressive attacks. This reduced U-boat effectiveness even when Hedgehog wasn't sinking boats directly. The threat of it changed behavior, made captains more careful, less willing to press attacks. And that's exactly what the Allies needed. U-boats that weren't attacking shipping weren't sinking ships. even if they weren't being sunk themselves. The numbers tell the story of how effective Hedgehog was. In 1942, before Hedgehog was widely deployed, escort attacks on U-boats had about a 5 to 6% success rate. You needed to attack roughly 17 to 20 times to sink one U-boat. By 1944, with Hedgehog widely deployed on escorts, the success rate jumped to about 25% for Hedgehog-equipped ships. 1 in 4 attacks resulted in a sinking or serious damage. That's a 4-fold improvement in lethality. Same crews, same basic tactics, but a much more effective weapon. Hedgehog-equipped escorts sank or damaged dozens of U-boats during the war. Exact attribution is difficult because many attacks involved multiple escorts, but Hedgehog was involved in a significant percentage of U-boat losses from 1943 onward. More importantly, Hedgehog changed the strategic balance. In 1942, U-boats were sinking 19 ships for every U-boat lost. By 1944, that ratio had reversed. The Allies were sinking more U-boats than U-boats were sinking ships. Hedgehog wasn't solely responsible for this reversal, but it was a major factor. It made escorts more dangerous. It reduced U-boat effectiveness. It turned convoy escort from a defensive mission into a submarine killing operation. The production numbers show Allied confidence in the weapon. By war's end, hundreds of Allied escorts were equipped with Hedgehog. The British produced over 4,000 Hedgehog projectiles per month at peak production. That's a lot of submarine killing capability being deployed into the Atlantic. From a U-boat crew's perspective, it meant that odds were constantly getting worse. More escorts had Hedgehog. Those escorts were getting better at using it, and your chances of surviving an attack were dropping. The casualty rate for U-boat crews reflects this. By 1944, about 75% of U-boat crewmen who went to sea didn't come home. 3 out of 4. That's catastrophic. And while not all those casualties were from Hedgehog directly, the weapon contributed significantly. It made escorts more lethal. It made convoy attacks more dangerous. It turned what had been a relatively survivable environment into a death trap. Some specific Hedgehog attacks became famous in anti-submarine warfare history. HMS Lagan sank U-270 in October 1943 with a Hedgehog attack. The U-boat had been shadowing a convoy, waiting for an attack opportunity. Lagan detected it with sonar and closed to attack range. The first Hedgehog pattern missed. The second pattern scored 1 hit. That single hit was enough. U-270 was so badly damaged it had to surface. The crew abandoned ship before it sank. What's notable is that this happened quickly. From initial detection to surfacing submarine took less than 30 minutes. With depth charges, the hunt might have lasted hours and probably would have failed. HMS Swale sank U-1191 in June 1944 with multiple Hedgehog patterns. The U-boat was submerged at 200 feet, trying to evade. Swale maintained perfect sonar contact and fired 3 Hedgehog patterns in succession. The third pattern hit. Multiple projectiles struck the hull. The submarine imploded from the combined damage. No survivors. HMS Con sank U-1006 in October 1944. This one's particularly notable because it showed how Hedgehog could hit submarines even on the ocean floor. U-1006's captain tried sitting on the bottom at 400 feet, thinking the depth and proximity to the seafloor would protect him. Con fired Hedgehog patterns anyway. The projectiles rained down on the submarine. Several hit and exploded. The submarine was crushed and flooded. This attack terrified other U-boat commanders. If sitting on the bottom wasn't safe, where could you hide? USS Buckley sank U-66 with Hedgehog in May 1944. This attack was textbook perfect. Good sonar contact, accurate firing, multiple hits. U-66 surfaced quickly, and the crew abandoned ship. The submarine sank within minutes. What these engagements showed was that Hedgehog worked in various circumstances: deep water, shallow water, moving targets, stationary targets. The weapon was versatile and deadly across different tactical situations. German Naval Command recognized Hedgehog as a serious threat and tried to develop countermeasures. Intelligence reports described the weapon. Interrogation of Allied prisoners provided details. German engineers analyzed recovered projectiles that failed to detonate. They tried several technical responses. Some U-boats got experimental armor plating on the pressure hull. Theory: if a Hedgehog projectile couldn't penetrate, it couldn't sink you. But the armor added weight, reduced performance, and wasn't thick enough anyway. A Hedgehog hit would still cause damage, even if it didn't penetrate completely. They tried building decoys, devices that would create a sonar echo similar to a submarine. Fire one away from your position. Hope the escort attacks the decoy instead. This worked occasionally, but rarely. Experienced sonar operators could tell the difference between a submarine and a decoy. And if you were close enough to fire a decoy, you were close enough to be detected yourself. They experimented with hull coatings to absorb sonar pulses, make the submarine harder to detect and track. But this was complex, expensive, and only marginally effective. The most promising technical response was the Type 1 U-boat. Faster underwater, quieter, better sonar detection equipment. It could potentially detect and evade Hedgehog escorts before they got into attack position. But the Type 1 came too late. The first operational boats didn't go on patrol until April 1945. By then, Germany was weeks from surrender. Too few, too late to matter. German tactical doctrine evolved to emphasize avoiding detection entirely. Don't attack convoys unless circumstances are ideal. Don't take unnecessary risks. Survive the patrol and come home. But this defeated the purpose of having U-boats at sea. If they weren't attacking shipping, they weren't accomplishing their mission. They were just trying to survive. Some U-boat commanders advocated for abandoning convoy attacks entirely. Focus on easier targets, single merchant ships, isolated targets far from escort coverage. But by 1944, there weren't many unescorted ships in the Atlantic. The convoy system had become nearly universal, and even lone merchants sometimes had escort ships nearby, ready to respond to attacks. The fundamental problem couldn't be solved with tactics or technology available to Germany. Hedgehog gave escorts a decisive advantage. U-boats couldn't effectively counter it. Hedgehog's impact extended beyond just sinking U-boats. The weapon changed the entire dynamic of convoy defense. Before Hedgehog, escorts were mostly defensive. They'd react to attacks, try to drive off U-boats, maybe get lucky, and sink one. With Hedgehog, escorts became offensive. They could actively hunt U-boats, maintain contact, attack accurately, kill efficiently. This meant U-boats had to spend more time evading and less time attacking. Even when they weren't being sunk, they were being suppressed, forced away from convoys, unable to operate effectively. The strategic effect was profound. In 1942, U-boats were winning the Battle of the Atlantic. By 1944, they'd clearly lost. Multiple factors contributed, but Hedgehog was significant. Convoys were getting through. Supplies were reaching Britain. The build-up for D-Day proceeded without serious interference from U-boats. The Atlantic supply line was secure. This had massive implications for the war. Without those supplies, Britain couldn't sustain its war effort. The Soviet Union couldn't receive American equipment. The invasion of Europe couldn't happen. Hedgehog helped make all of that possible by making convoy escorts effective submarine killers. The weapon also influenced post-war anti-submarine warfare development. The concept, forward-throwing weapons with contact fuses, became standard. Modern anti-submarine systems trace their lineage back to Hedgehog. The US Navy developed improved versions. The Weapon Alpha system used similar principles, but with better guidance. Modern anti-submarine rockets use the same basic concept of forward-throwing projectiles with impact fuses. The British continued developing Hedgehog into other systems. The Limbo mortar used the same contact fuse principle, but fired larger, heavier projectiles. The accounts from U-boat crews who survived Hedgehog attacks are harrowing. Gunter Ruppelt, a sonar operator on U-1051, described a Hedgehog attack in early 1945. We heard the splashes, maybe 20 or 25 separate impacts. We knew what they were, the British weapon that exploded on contact. We waited. The boat was silent, everyone holding their breath. Then we heard the ping. One of the projectiles hitting the hull. It didn't explode. Dud, maybe, or hit at a bad angle. But we felt the impact through the whole boat, like someone hitting the hull with a giant hammer. 2 seconds later, another hit. This one exploded. The pressure wave felt like the ocean was trying to crush us. The lights went out. Men were thrown against bulkheads. When emergency lighting came on, we were taking water from a cracked seam. The captain surfaced immediately. Better to surrender than drown. Ruppelt's boat survived, but barely. He said the randomness was the worst part. Why did that first projectile not explode? Pure luck. If it had exploded, they'd all be dead. Another account from Otto, Westphalen, commander of U-968. We were attacking a convoy near Iceland. I fired torpedoes and dove immediately. Standard procedure. Go deep. Evade the escorts. I heard the splashes. I knew instantly. Hedgehog. I'd been briefed on it. I ordered maximum speed and hard turn to port. The projectiles rained down around us. I could hear them hitting the water, sinking rapidly. Then one exploded. Not a direct hit, but close, maybe 10 meters away. The explosion damaged our stern planes. We couldn't control depth properly after that, had to abort the patrol and limp home. One weapon, one attack, mission over. That's when I knew. Attacking convoys wasn't worth it anymore. The risks were too high. Werner Hartenstein, who commanded U-156 before its loss, wrote about Hedgehog in reports. The weapon has changed everything. Our old tactics assume depth charge attacks we can evade, but this weapon tracks us during the attack. It hits us where we are, not where we were. There is no evasion technique that reliably works. I have recommended that U-boat command reconsider convoy attack doctrine. The casualty rate is unsustainable. We are losing boats faster than we sink ships. This is not acceptable. Hartenstein died when his boat was sunk in 1943, before Hedgehog became widespread. But his assessment was prescient. The weapon really had changed everything. By late 1944 and early 1945, U-boat operations had essentially collapsed under the weight of Allied anti-submarine improvements. Hedgehog was one major factor, but it worked in combination with other developments: better radar, improved sonar, more escorts, escort carriers providing air cover, code breaking revealing U-boat positions. All of these together created an environment where U-boats couldn't operate effectively. The Atlantic had become a death trap. U-boat commanders knew this. Dönitz knew this. But the war demanded that U-boats continue operations even when those operations were futile. New crews were sent out with minimal training. They had no chance against experienced Allied escorts with Hedgehog and other improved weapons. Many were sunk on their first patrol. The casualty rate reached staggering levels. In some months, more U-boats were sunk than went on patrol. The service was being annihilated. Some boats simply refused to attack. They go on patrol, report false contact failures, and return. Better to face court-martial than certain death in a hopeless attack. The last U-boat sunk by Hedgehog was U-3523 in May 1945, just days before Germany surrendered. The war was effectively over, but Allied escorts were still hunting and killing U-boats with their improved weapons. When Germany finally surrendered, surviving U-boat crews were almost relieved. The nightmare was over. They'd lived through what many of their comrades hadn't. Post-war analysis confirmed what U-boat crews had experienced. Hedgehog and other improved anti-submarine weapons had decisively shifted the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats that once terrorized Allied shipping had been hunted nearly to extinction. The ocean that had been their hunting ground became their grave, and Hedgehog was one of the weapons that made that transformation possible. The Hedgehog story teaches several crucial lessons about naval warfare and military technology. First, incremental improvements matter enormously. Hedgehog wasn't revolutionary technology. It was a better application of existing concepts. But that better application increased lethality by 400%. Second, weapons that maintain contact with targets are far more effective than weapons that lose contact during attacks. This seems obvious now, but was a revelation in the 1940s. Third, the psychological impact of a weapon can be as important as its direct effects. Hedgehog made U-boat crews fearful and cautious, reducing effectiveness even when the weapon wasn't sinking boats. Fourth, mass production and deployment matters. Hedgehog wasn't effective because a few ships had it. It became effective when hundreds of escorts were equipped with it and trained in its use. Fifth, defenders can win through superior weapons and tactics even when outnumbered. The U-boats had numerical advantages at times, but Allied escorts with Hedgehog and other improvements could defeat them consistently. Modern anti-submarine warfare still follows principles established by Hedgehog. Forward-throwing weapons, contact fusing, maintain target tracking during attacks, multiple projectiles to increase hit probability. These concepts work just as well against modern submarines as they did against World War II U-boats. The technology has advanced dramatically, but the fundamental principles remain sound. For years, U-boat captains hunted merchant ships with confidence. They feared destroyers somewhat. Depth charges were dangerous, but survivable, evadable. The odds were in the U-boat's favor. Then came the Hedgehog, a weird-looking weapon that changed everything. It threw small projectiles ahead of the escort. It maintained sonar contact during attacks. It only exploded on contact with something solid. And suddenly, attacking convoys became suicide. The escorts could hit you accurately, could maintain tracking, could kill you efficiently. The U-boat captains who dominated the Atlantic for years found themselves hunted, unable to operate effectively, dying in increasing numbers. The ocean filled with escorts carrying Hedgehog. Every convoy had them. Every attack risked encountering them, and encountering them meant a very high chance of dying. The U-boats that had terrorized Allied shipping became prey. The hunters became the hunted. Because one weapon, one strange-looking mortar that threw contact-fused projectiles, had turned the Atlantic into a trap. The merchant ships U-boat captains didn't fear were suddenly deadly, because their escorts had Hedgehog, and the Atlantic became a grave for submarines that once ruled it.